Hi everybody and welcome back to Video Game Trivia. This time on Video Game Trivia, we're taking a look at Konami's action horror game series, Castlevania. Now, I previously mentioned that the series, which is called Akumajo Dracula in Japan, is occasionally also referred to by the title Vampire Killer. It's the name of the first level theme in the first Castlevania, it's the name of the MSX game, and it's also the name of the Belmont's magical whip. It's also, specifically, you might be surprised to hear, the name of the Sega Mega Drive/Genesis title, Castlevania Bloodlines in Japan. For a long time, there's been some amount of confusion as to the lineage of Trevor Belmont in relation to Simon Belmont, as he was the first of Simon's ancestors ever featured in the games. The original manual referred to Trevor as Simon's grandfather, but looking at the timeline of the series, it's obviously impossible for that to be true. Trevor's adventure takes place in 1476, while Simon's quest, and I do refer to his first quest to defeat Dracula, takes place in 1691, well over 200 years later. This, however, can be put down to a simple translation mishap, since in the early days Konami was notorious for making their manuals not very reliable. Simon's actual grandfather is actually Christopher Belmont, featured in the Game Boy game Castlevania The Adventure. We've talked quite a bit about the names of Castlevania games, but you might be surprised to find out that there are 3 other games besides the original 1986/1987 NES title that are also called simply Castlevania. The first and most notorious of these, of course, is Castlevania for the Nintendo 64, which, despite being called Castlevania 64 by fans, is not actually the title of the game. It's just Castlevania. In the PAL region, the Game Boy Advance game Circle of the Moon is simply called Castlevania as well. Also in the early 2000s, Konami apparently tried to get rid of the Akumajo label for the Castlevania series and actually released 3 games in the series in Japan using the Castlevania moniker. The first 2 were Harmony of Dissonance and Aria of Sorrow. And wouldn't you know it, Lament of Innocence in Japan was simply called Castlevania. Speaking of the first Castlevania, unless you were aware, it is technically the most remade game of the entire series. Now, of course, there were already technically 2 different versions of it when it first came out. The more famous NES version and the less famous MSX game Vampire Killer. Even though they're not exactly the same, both games deal with Simon Belmont's quest to defeat Dracula, and therefore can be considered alternate versions of the same story. The late 80s Castlevania arcade game, Haunted Castle, is also a retelling of Simon's quest to defeat Dracula, albeit it also has the element of Simon rescuing his bride from Dracula. The Super Nintendo game Super Castlevania 4, despite its name, is actually just a remake of the first game again, with Simon going up against Dracula. And there was an even further remake for the Sharp home computers in Japan, which was later ported to the PlayStation under the title Castlevania Chronicles. This is the version where Simon looks like an anorexic supermodel. Castlevania Dracula X, which is a sort of port of the PC Engine game Akumajo Dracula X Rondo of Blood, indeed gets its name just from that particular title, Akumajo Dracula X. European censors, however, seem to think that the X carried some kind of lewd connotation, which is why this game was renamed for the European release as Vampire's Kiss. While this title change is kinda cool, what they did with the Sega Mega Drive title, Castlevania Bloodlines, isn't. Apparently, the European censors didn't like the idea of the word blood being in the title and renamed the game Castlevania The New Generation. I mean, really, Bloodlines. How stupid can you get? One of the most highly lauded titles of the franchise, Symphony of the Night, isn't actually called that in Japan. Its original title is Nocturne of Moonlight. However, if you're at all aware of the Castlevania mythos, this title change won't surprise you at all, because Konami has always liked fucking around with the subtitles of the Castlevania games. It does beg the question why Nocturne of Moonlight was changed, because it is actually a fairly good title. While the actual reason for the name change is not clear, it is obvious that Symphony of the Night is emulating the title of the first major Dracula movie version, Nosferatu, Eine Symphonie des Grauens, which means the Symphony of Fear. And returning to Castlevania for the Nintendo 64, it is obvious why it's become labeled as Castlevania 64, as there is nothing else in the title to distinguish it from the rest of the franchise, yet the Japanese version did have a subtitle. The Japanese title for the game is Akumajo Dracula Moku Shiroku, which translates roughly as Apocalypse. My question here is, why not just use that as the title of the game? And finally, let's return back to the roots of the series. By the time the NES was out in North America, in Japan, the Famicom had received itself an add-on unit which was called the Nintendo Disk Drive. It was basically just a floppy disk drive, but it had the noted advantage of extra storage, which allows some Famicom games to have much better graphical and audio outputs than was previously possible. Konami, in particular, loved using the Famicom disk drive, and it was the disk drive originally that actually made it possible for Nintendo to make a save game feature for The Legend of Zelda. They also made one for Metroid, but in the Western versions, they had to come up with different solutions because there wasn't an equivalent device for the NES. The Western versions of Zelda, of course, relied on a battery-packed save, while sadly most other games, like Metroid, received an overtly complicated password system. The same fate befell Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, which, yes, in the Japanese version had a save game feature instead of a password. However, it was Castlevania 3 that was severely cut down due to the lack of a disk drive in the Western versions of the NES. Graphic detail and even some of the audio tracks needed to be streamlined in order to comply to the technical limitations of the NES. Recognizing these problems, though, the Western version of Castlevania 3 is loaded with helpful cheat codes which are not present in the original Japanese version. That's all for me for now. I'm TheHande. See you on the next one.